All right, hello and welcome back. I'm David.
I'm Bill.
And we're back with you today to discuss some of the pros and cons of collective bargaining.
You know, it's a shame that we have to be here talking about this all the time, but if you've been watching the political landscape, you see that it's pretty obvious that this is the direction that they're looking at going in. So, looking at some of the interviews that took place in Roanoke, it was mainly the topic of collective bargaining and doing away with the right to work law. So we want to make sure our men and women are educated on what dangers that will bring.
Absolutely, Bill. And in doing so, we decided that we were going to bring you the pros and cons
Right.
from an objective perspective and try to evaluate it a little bit further and really point out some of the things that could be good, and then many of the things that are bad. Unfortunately, that list is a little bit longer than the pros here.
Well, anytime you're changing things like this, you got to look at what it will do and how it affects you as a body.
Mm-hmm.
And as we look at it, there's some things that may sound positive to some people, but there's a lot of things that it's going to be really bad.
Yeah. So let's jump right in. The first thing that we have here under the pro category is job security. And this can be a good thing and a bad thing. But the one thing that we want to point out here is that with respect to job security, sometimes that can really lead to bad results where you can't get rid of a police officer, even a bad police officer.
Well, you and I both know, working in the field of law enforcement, you've seen bad police officers, you've seen great police officers, and you've seen mediocre police officers. And, you know, the one thing that you don't want is a bad police officer on the street that's giving everybody the bad name. And we've seen from study after study that if they're members of the union, that even bad police officers are protected through that process. And everyone knows, once you get someone in the area that you work in that's a bad police officer, that reflects on every one of you in the area. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I guess for some people who are not good police officers, they feel that's job security if they have a union.
Absolutely. Bill, the next one that I want to talk about is potentially reduced income inequality.
Right.
And how this plays out, it can play out, of course, in the good, as to bring somebody up to another equivalent agency, like another state police agency. But what I'd like to focus in on is what it would look like in Virginia, because as we pointed out in a previous video, the collective bargaining proposal in Virginia shows that there would be one statewide law enforcement bargaining unit. Right. So all the statewide law enforcement, game, Marine police, state police, would all be in one unit.
Yep.
And so if it comes to income inequality in that context, those folks who make less money than the state police are going to come up to the level of state police before state police ever gets any more money. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, putting everyone under one umbrella never works. I mean, it's different job descriptions that you do more. The state police has way more responsibilities than the game commission. They have way more responsibilities than marine resources. Even though they're all law enforcement, they're all tasked and sworn and able to enforce the laws, we're tasked with many other aspects of policing, and we are policing the police. So it's really unfair to put everyone under the same umbrella, but that's going to be the goal of this bargaining unit, is to get everyone up to the pay equal to each other. So I think it leads to more recruiting issues, and those recruiting issues will take place because if there's a position in the game commission or marine resource or ABC or whatever that state agency is, and there's less headaches with the agency that has the equal pay, that's where they're going first. They're not coming to us that have to do multifaceted policing as the state police has to do.
That is very, very true. Bill, another thing that we might often hear with respect to collective bargaining is greater employee rights.
Right.
And one thing that comes to mind, you've already made mention of it here, and that is the potential consideration to repeal right to work. That being one of the premier rights for employees in the state. And what it really means is you don't have to join the union if you don't want to. If Virginia repeals it, as some Democrats said that they would be inclined to do so, then everybody would be forced to be part of the union. And of course, that would be less employee rights. Now, as a general measure, collective bargaining would give you better rights in terms of bargaining. It's forced bargaining. It's not the law now in Virginia. So in some respects, there would be more employee rights.
Well, it goes back to the comments that I've made several times. Right to work was put in place in 1947, I think.
Yes.
And it was in order to keep people from shutting businesses down. And it was to prevent unions that want to go in and establish, which they legally can do today in private industry, and force people to join the union. And if you do away with the right to work, then you're going to have employees that may not want to join the union, but would be forced to do so because of everything that they do from that point forward. If the right to work law is gone and collective bargaining takes place, if you're not a part of that union, you're not going to benefit from any of it. And I think everything that we hear thus far in the conversations that are going on today, the goal is to do away with right to work in Virginia and usher in collective bargaining. So you're getting both. You're not just getting one. And that's even more dangerous to the state police, because then if you have a grievance or if you have salary issues that's going on, and you're not a part of the union, you're not getting anything. And we have people in the Department of State Police that are not members of this association, nor are they members of the PBA. They just want to be left alone and do their job, and they equally benefit. So, I think it's a slippery slope. I mean, you might have more employee rights if you just had collective bargaining in a right to work state, but if you do away with right to work and get collective bargaining, you don't have it.
Very true, sir. The next thing that I want to bring up that we often hear, and this probably comes up more than any other point with respect to the discussion around collective bargaining, and that is pay.
Right.
We just discussed one aspect of that in terms of that statewide single bargaining unit and what that would look like if everybody was included together. But it comes up as a general matter too, and there are a number of really important considerations to be made. One of which is that the money's got to come from somewhere, and Virginia has a constitutional amendment requirement for a balanced budget.
Yeah, and that's where I don't know how well this can work, because a lot of collective bargaining states don't have a constitutional amendment that says that you have to balance this budget. You can't pay out more than you're receiving. So let's just say a collective bargaining unit gets to an agreement of a 5% increase for the group that they're bargaining for, whether it be corrections or whether it be law enforcement or healthcare workers, whatever that might be, and they present it, then they're not going to get the money. There's no money there to get, because if the budget is in a shortfall, or if it's stagnant and not growing, then the money that you're receiving isn't enough to pay out. So I really don't know that collective bargaining will even work that well in a right or a constitutional amendment state, because the General Assembly doesn't have a choice, because the people of Virginia voted to make that part of our Constitution that you can't spend more than you bring in. Something that the federal government should have today.
That's exactly right, Bill, and that's probably the most important issue on both it being the most important issue and all of the things that have to be considered when considering whether or not we could afford to do what is proposed to be done under collective bargaining. Let's jump over to a few of the negatives of collective bargaining. And the first of that is union dues. So in terms of union dues, while we don't know exactly what it would cost,
Right.
but we do have a good idea based upon other places that have collective bargaining, about 1% to 2% of the annual salary. That's what folks will pay to be a union member.
Right. Well, I think if you look at the fiscal impact that was given in the General Assembly with the Bill 917 and 2764, when they spell out that it costs $96 million for every 1% that you give state employees, they were referring, that was the hidden message that they were referring, that looking at other states, the amount of money that these bargaining units receive is about how much they're going to be paid, because they're going to take that out first of whatever they're bargaining for. So if, for instance, if they're bargaining for a 5% raise, the employee's only going to receive 4 and the union's going to get 1 of it.
Yeah.
Which, it's a lot of money. And I don't know that a lot of people realizes how much that costs. And when we look at our dues, we struggle over any increases, even though the cost of everything goes up to pay the light bills, to travel, to do the things that we got to do. When you're looking at being able to receive 1% of that,
or up to 2%.
Up to 2, yeah.
Yeah.
Some states
Mm-hmm.
allow up to 2%.
Yeah.
So, we don't know where this will go and how much that will be, but it's a lot more than what the members are paying today.
Mm-hmm. And that's across the board, across the associations that exist today.
Right.
It's going to be considerably more money, and that's
just not this association.
Right.
That's every.
And it's an important thing to think about in terms of, you might get some money on the back end, but remember, every single year you're going to pay that 1% to 2% of your annual salary and union dues.
And you think about what that equals out to over a career. If they were successful in getting a 3% or a 2.5%, and they're getting 1% of that each year over a 20-year period, 20% of your monies went to unions, and it affects your final average compensation at the end of your career.
Mm-hmm. It's just not going to shake out maybe the
It's
way
not,
that folks think it's going to.
I think they like the fact that you have a bargaining unit that forces you to the table to bargain, but the two things that still remain is if there's no money, there's no way to pay it, and constitutionally bound to do that.
Yep.
And the other thing is, they're getting wealthy off of your percentage raises that we have done for you over the last 50 years of going to bat for you in the General Assembly.
Absolutely. One thing that I was thinking about in terms of potential cons is reference to a Heritage Foundation study from not too long ago, and they cited that the implementation of collective bargaining could raise taxes for the average family between $2,300 and $3,000 a year.
So the Heritage Foundation is a very legitimate organization that looks at things very conservatively. So they're dismissed by one group, but embraced by another. But the one thing that they actually do is they look at these states, and they have been looking at them for years, that have collective bargaining. And it's been a national conversation. And that national conversation is, does states that have collective bargaining have the ability to tell their voters that with collective bargaining, these things are going to work for you and not cost you any money? Well, what they have found, the average cost per family is about $2,300 to $3,000. So now the collective bargaining. If you're a state employee and you're in the collective bargaining and you're paying 1% of whatever that increase would be, you're giving up 1%.
Yeah.
Then now you're also giving up $3,000 for having collective bargaining in the state,
Mm-hmm.
because it's $12 million just to set the framework up.
Again, I just don't think that it's going to shake out the way that folks think that it might.
No.
One thing that really drew my attention when we were looking at Senate Bill 917, and that was grievances. There's a structure for grievances in the proposal that passed the House and the Senate, but was vetoed this past session. In terms of the grievance, the bargaining unit agent would have complete control over that process. They'd be able to be involved in it, and that's union members and non-union members alike. If you were a non-union member and you decided that you wanted to file a grievance, the union representative can be there to watch your grievance. If you're a non-union member and you decide that you want representation, you have to hire the union attorney.
Right.
They can charge you whatever they're going to charge you, and they can take it out of your payroll. And so that, of course, was quite alarming to me. And in terms of your right to be able to do that, it only extends to that initial grievance. If you're a non-union member, you don't want the union involved, you have to take whatever the result is from that process. And if you wanted to appeal that beyond that point, you would have to have the union involved. So I don't think that even though it may look like standard due process in terms of the way it's set up, I think that it's definitely lacking in terms of non-union members and employee rights once this thing might be in place.
And a lot of people may not be happy with the grievance procedure per se. They do feel it's weighted more towards the agency, and I understand that. But they're going to control everything at that point. And if you think the agency's heavy-handed, if you're not a part of their union, it's really going to be heavy-handed. And, the disciplinary actions that take place during that period of time will be more heavily on those non-members than it will be the members. So it is, keep in mind that the working trooper is covered under these, but if it's a supervisor from sergeant and above, they have to have their own collective bargaining unit, and they don't even have to recognize them.
That's exactly
so
right.
It's almost futile to say that you have a supervisor, because your actual supervisor is the bargaining unit and the 5-member panel.
That's exactly right. And speaking of discipline, one thing that I want to point out in terms of collective bargaining, and we know this from looking around the country, and there's no finer example in terms of discipline or the inability to discipline than that which happened in Minneapolis in 2020 and the time before that. But one statistic for you, from 2012 to 2020, there were 2,600 complaints of misconduct in Minneapolis Police Department. There were only 12 instances of discipline, with the most severe being 40 hours suspension. Yeah. And it's also important to point out that they're a union-led agency. And I just don't think that that's adequate. And in fact, we know from other studies that the discipline is problematic. We know it from other cities and other studies. I think that ultimately that's going to be a huge problem when it comes to a well-regulated agency like VSP.
And I've said that many times, we're disciplined, and that's one of the things that set us apart from other agencies, is having a well-disciplined agency that we have. And one of the things that you'll see when you're out there working is the discipline that a trooper displays on the road is a lot more than what someone in another agency that hasn't had the training that we have and has the requirements under policies how to operate, and all that goes away. because we'll be looked at it as every other agency. And it was like having the trooper in here yesterday saying, well, if you're complaining about wearing your hat, why did you take this job? Because you knew you were required to do it. If you were concerned about the discipline that takes place in the traditional areas of what the state police has always been known for, then why did you come to the state police? This is what we do. And all that will go away. All that will be gone. The discipline that comes with the agency as we knew it.
It surely will. And one thing that I'd like to also point out is that in terms of conflicts, because that's a real conflict, but there can be other inherent conflicts of interest with respect to collective bargaining. And what that looks like, Bill, is it's different than private collective bargaining. In private collective bargaining, you've got two sides, you've got a separation of interest. But with public employee collective bargaining, everybody has a secondary interest, but it's not what's being negotiated for, right?
Right.
And so, obviously you've got politicians on one side and their appointees who have aspirations of remaining in office. And then on the other side, you have people who have aspirations of getting better pay, better benefits, and things like this, right? Of course, all of this is in the context of the requirement for a balanced budget. But importantly, what's being negotiated in the taxpayer dollars is not the primary concern of the negotiation, even though that is the sum of what's being negotiated. And what that means is that there's an inherent conflict of interest there, a conflict of interest that runs very deep and has caused lots of budgetary problems. And we talked about cost, but there'll be budgetary problems beyond that within agencies and across agencies in Virginia if this were to become a law. Because of the fact that folks are trying to spend money, and they don't have any regard for it not being their own.
Well, look at it in a political standpoint. I ran for office 9 or 8 times. Everything that I did was transparent. Everything that I received from contributors was transparent. I did the conflict of interest filings. I did all those things to show where the money came from, who gave, who did in kinds, and so forth. Well, now it's going to be a situation to where a politician who supports collective bargaining and to do away with the right to work, that money is going to funnel in to those individuals
Directly to them.
Directly to them. And that's been seen in other states where that happens. And so it's given power to one political party that is supportive of all these things. And so what you have is there's so much money going to be generated by the union when they get their percentage of money for doing these collective bargaining issues, that they are going to say that the elected official who's controlled by them because of the money is going to say, well, I don't have a choice. They bargained for 5% for all state employees or 10%. So we're going to have to raise taxes because we've got to pay this. So they're using the taxpayers' money to remain in office. And it's not it's not a willful contribution. It's a taking of money by the government to keep it going. And that's the conflict of interest that a lot of people, whether you're a state employee or not, should be looking at, because that's going to be a lot of money, and that's going to create a lot of issues, especially transparency wise.
Yeah. And
not to mention the fact that we're required to police all agencies, and now we're going to be the same part of the union as these.
All the rest of them potentially.
Yeah, I mean it's.
Yeah.
How are you going to investigate these people?
Yeah. It's going to be a difficult proposition.
Very difficult. It's not going to be a unbiased investigation. There's just no way it can be.
And you spoke of transparency. We know that from the looks of Senate Bill 917, there isn't transparency in that process, the collective bargaining process.
Right, they're not required to do anything.
Yes, not subject to FOIA. They're not required to have open meetings. They're not required to be transparent about what happens and how it happens. And I think personally that that's pretty troubling.
Well, as an attorney, you should,
Sure.
because everything that you do defense-wise and to try to represent your client, it hinges upon transparency and FOIA-able information.
Absolutely.
Well, there's nothing that they're subject to. There's no laws that this 5-member board is subject to. And then they have powers. They have power to subpoena you. They have powers to do things that not even a police officer can do without a court order, and that's troubling too.
Sure. One thing that we've touched on, and it deals with, again, employee rights, because it can fall on either side of this, pros or cons. Arguably, there could be less employee rights, and particularly if, as 5 Democrats last Wednesday in Roanoke stated that they would be inclined to repeal right to work, which, as we mentioned, would allows the employee to decide whether or not they want to be a union member or not. Whether or not that they follow through with that and they repeal it. If they repeal it, there's arguably fewer rights for employees.
I just, and I'm going to tell it in a story. I think back to the coal strikes, and I think about all the years that I worked over there, and before I became a trooper, I designed mining tools, parts for equipment, and I know that there was a lot of people who were union, but there was a lot of people who were just hardworking people that got up every morning and went to work. And so when the coal strikes took place in 1986, 87 time frame, and we were sent out there to ensure that those people that were not unions, that wanted to work, that were non-union, that were on strike, they could go in and they couldn't shut the business down. They couldn't shut the coal mine down in order to go in and do the job that they were required to do. And that's why businesses love the right to work, is because they can't shut them down, because there's always someone hungry enough to work.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about a family who's struggling and they know that I can't afford to go on strike. I have to go to work tomorrow. Well, without the right to work, they're not going to work tomorrow. And you're going to leave some of these families desolate with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really important. And I just use the coal field because we've seen it firsthand when we were out there at a strike. These people were in fear of their life to go to work, but they had to work. And so they went. Yeah, they had to support their family. And it holds true to auto manufacturers in Virginia, the shipyards. There was a strike there because of the government contracts. Any organization that has unionized, and will be more of them unionized if this passes and this right to work goes away, because they will shut businesses down. And of course, businesses are going to say, no, I'm not going to stay in Virginia. I'll take my business to a state that has a right to work. It is very, very dangerous road we're treading. It's a slippery slope we don't want to get out.
Again, and it will change the landscape of Virginia's public employee. Bill, I'd like to take 3 points all together. One is reduced managerial flexibility and greater disciplinary problems, which we touched on, but I want to make some additional points, and reduced efficiency in law enforcement. Now, all 3 of these things are items that have been studied. With respect to the reduced efficiency in law enforcement, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, they did a study. They said that in New Jersey, when officers didn't win an arbitration, that means they didn't get what they wanted when they were collectively bargaining, right? Arrest rates declined and crime rates increased. So we know that. It's empirical. They've shown it. And of course, that's a unionized state there. And then with respect to disciplinary problems, in 2003, a Florida study showed that collective bargaining rights when it was imposed for sheriff's officers. It led to a substantial increase in violent incidents of misconduct related to sheriff's deputies relative to police officers who were already collective bargaining units. See, in 2003, the sheriffs sued, went to the Supreme Court in Florida. They were granted collective bargaining rights. The study took place post 2003, and it showed this substantial increase in violent misconduct among the sheriff's officers. And then one additional study from the Institute of Labor Economics in 2021 showed that the introduction of collective bargaining is clearly associated and linked with more police killings of non-white civilians. I think those are just troubling statistics when it comes down to, we know that it's going to interrupt the managerial relationship with the employee. And we know that it leads to less efficiency. We want more efficiency, obviously, to have a safe community. And then, of course, you've got this broader problem, the Derek Chauvin problem of serious disciplinary problems.
You know, I just can't understand how the one party that's pushing this forward, who in 2020 had an outcry, the fact that there has to be justice reform, that there's no disciplinary actions within agencies, that police officers just have gone to the extreme of taking the law in their own hands, and we need justice reform. And they cite these very things that you just went through as to why justice reform is needed. And then you read how unionization created that, and now they're asking for unionization. And you know, it's a double-edged sword. It's talking out both sides of your mouth. You can't have unionization and have justice reform, because there's no way, without the disciplinary abilities to keep individuals in line. It's your whole job as a law enforcement officer in the general public, when you go to civil disturbances or whatever, is to discipline those individuals who are out of line.
To maintain order.
To maintain order. And that's what a supervisor is required to do within an agency. And they're taking all that away. And it just don't work. And it shows, study after study after study shows that it'll create a lazy workforce. It'll create a workforce that's undisciplined, and it'll create situations that you can't come back from. Your agency will decline over and over and over. So, you know, we really got to understand more as to why they want to do this, and take away the political aspect of the money that they're going to be receiving if they go down this road.
And Bill, I'd like to end on one really salient point, again from another study. This comes from the Harvard Business Review, and it showed that union workers are less happy than non-union workers. In fact, it's negatively related to job satisfaction. Unionization creates less job satisfaction, which is really an interesting takeaway, because you know, most advocates for collective bargaining will say that it will improve conditions, but we know across these studies it actually makes the situation worse in multiple impactful categories.
Well, think about it. If you're out here busting your hump every day, trying to do the things that you're required to do in the job, and let's face it, you are your own boss when you're out there on the highway. You create your own situation by the work that you do. If you're working your wrecks and you're answering your calls and you're writing tickets to discipline the traveling public, or if you're investigating your cases, you're making cases, then you're doing your job, and there's very little going to be said to you. But every one of us know that there's this person out there who is just not doing anything. He's just drawing a paycheck. And so it leads to a lazy workforce, and it makes things very difficult for all those people who are really seriously wanting to do the job and they go out there and they work every day. They put their 8 hours in, whether they are writing 1,000 tickets a year or 3,000 tickets a year. They're handling their calls, they're doing everything, and they're working. But every one of them are unhappy because nobody's doing anything to the guy who's sloughing all the calls off on them. And so that's where the unhappiness comes in, is you've got the one or two guys who are out there who's doing nothing, that's drawing a check, and some of them may be drawing more than you are, and they're doing nothing and nobody can do anything to them. And I think the workforce recognizes it, and that's why these studies have showed, from the Harvard Business Review, that these things are very prevalent in the workforce. And look, the nation voted by records for Donald Trump to go in and to straighten some of these things out, because the offices in Washington D.C. were occupied. They found that there was people drawing checks that weren't even working. There were people that were asleep on the job. There were people that couldn't name 5 things that they did during a week. I mean, how many? We can sit here and name 5 things we did before we came down here.
Duplicative job roles. I mean, the list goes on and
It
on.
was amazing. So, if the public hasn't seen now, and that was because they're unionized,
Every single last one.
and the president has tried to penetrate that union, but we've seen how powerful they are.
Yep.
Not even the president can penetrate it.
So I think that certainly this was informative. I hope that you've found it to be so, and I really appreciate you tuning in, Bill. Thank you, and we look forward to the next conversation, because this is not going away.
I appreciate nicer chairs. The last ones we had,
I
was
know.
like,
I think we're more comfortable this time.
we're gonna have to get a hoist to get me out of it because it was so low.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.